In the last 16 years, nothing has really come close to contending with my favourite game of all time, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. The last generation had some incredible games, including the likes of Last of Us Part 2, Ghost of Tsushima and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the latter being my first Zelda game and an experience I will never forget. One title absent from my playlist was God of War. The title released in 2018, a time where I just settled down with the wife and we had our first kid. It's been almost 3 years since the game released and I finally had the time to sit down and play it. As the credits rolled, I felt somewhat conflicted and uncertain. I had to play the game a second time before I could really settle on a verdict. But before I get too ahead of myself, let's start at the beginning. The God of War franchise has seen a number of entries in the series, starting with the original game way back in 2005. For the purpose of this intro, I'm going to focus on the mainline entries in the series, God of War 1 to 3. The series protagonist is Kratos, a Spartan warrior who helms from the land of Sparta, a brutal and powerful mythological warrior race that has seen many depictions throughout game and film. Leading into the events of God of War, Kratos quickly rose the ranks to become general of his army. He's brutal, formidable and unforgiving in combat, and his army grows from the hundreds to the thousands. Eventually his accolades earn him recognition with the gods. You see, the game is heavily influenced by Greek mythology and hence contains references to a number of gods like Ares and Zeus. The army of Sparta is almost brought to ruin when Kratos leads the charge against the barbarian horde. As he watches his army get massacred, Kratos offers his life and service to Ares, the god of war, in exchange for Ares defeating the barbarians. Ares accepts his offer, sensing enormous power in Kratos, and puts the barbarian horde to rest. Kratos, now a servant of Ares, leads the Spartan army into conquering all of Greece. During his battles, Kratos comes across a village and puts the residents to the sword and their homes to the flame. Not realizing that Ares had tricked him, Kratos in his rage-driven bloodlust slaughters everyone within his sights. As his bloodlust clears, Kratos comes to the realization that his final two victims were his own wife and daughter. The village oracle curses Kratos, binding the ashes of his dead family to his skin, the new pale coating earning him the title the Ghost of Sparta. This event sets the tone for the rest of the series as Kratos goes on a bloody quest for revenge. Throughout the series, Kratos uncovers many secrets, such as his father being the all-powerful Zeus. I make mention of the word all-powerful as the gods from God of War claim to be this. And in typical Kratos fashion, he puts that claim to the test. Kratos eventually kills Ares and in turn becomes the God of War himself. The cliffhanger ending of God of War 2 has to be one of my favourites in gaming history, as Kratos, who after being shunned and almost destroyed by the other gods, climbs Mount Olympus ready to kill Zeus and all others claiming to be a god. In 2010 we finally got our hands on God of War 3, the finale to this awesome trilogy. After killing all the other gods, Kratos finally goes toe to toe with his father Zeus and beats him to death with his bare hands, ending the reign of Olympians once and for all. If I could sum up the entire trilogy in a few words, it'd be this.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
In 2013, after years of perfecting its bloody brand of hack and slash combat, the franchise seemed to be at an impasse. The release of the spin-off, a prequel titled God of War Ascension, had resulted in a fun but overly familiar experience. It quickly became clear that a spark was missing. The franchise needed to go bold or go home. Therefore, like the original trilogy, I went into this reimagining of God of War expecting something familiar and great. But I never expected to run into a masterpiece of modern gaming. God of War is the perfect starting point for someone unfamiliar with the franchise, yet it's also a deep, respectful and rather bold sequel to the original series of games. It acts as a sort of new chapter in its protagonist's life, picking up many years after the end of God of War 3 and swapping its mythology from Greek to Norse. The vengeful and violent man who once sought to slaughter the Greek gods has vanished. In his stead, we are introduced to a mature, gritty and pleasantly realistic view of a husband now living in the northern forests of Midgard. The game's opening frame is powerful as we see Kratos chopping down a tree, the wood from this tree then being used to create ashes from the death of his second wife. It's moving seeing this powerful figure troubled by the loss of those he's loved. It's here where the story takes an interesting turn, as we are introduced to Atreus, Kratos' son. The simplicity of the story setup is one of the game's greatest strengths. The goal is simple: scatter the ashes of Faye amongst the highest mountain top, a final wish from Kratos' wife. In typical God of War fashion, Kratos' new life is threatened at the might of the Norse gods. He must teach Atreus to learn how to survive in a strange and untamed land. I'll say this about the story: it's thematically rich and a surprisingly resonant look at fatherhood. The Kratos and Atreus dynamic is one of the most rounded and believable to ever be featured in a game, as it evolves naturally over the course of the narrative and has distinct ramifications on the gameplay itself. Minor moments like Kratos telling Atreus a story to pass the time while sailing, or Atreus seeking Kratos' approval after a long battle, adds an emotional depth to the characters that has been missing in previous games. You really care for Kratos here, which is something that hasn't been entirely possible before. He is a much more mature person, still haunted by his past, and he has something actually worth fighting for. The game goes out of its way to communicate that vengeance is a path to nothing other than self-destruction, with Kratos having to teach his son how to be better than the gods that came before him. What this game does for the character of Kratos is simply unbelievable. In terms of scope, the game is much larger than any of the previous titles. While not completely open world, you're able to travel through 6 of the 9 realms of the Norse cosmos. Each of these realms offers up their own map for exploration. The only downside to the larger environments is that you'll be doing a fair bit of backtracking during the story. Luckily, the beautifully rendered locations from stunning mountain vistas to crystal clear lakes never make them a chore to return to. God of War not only retains the brutal, high-octane combat and the focus on mythology, but also turns the franchise into an open linear, narrative-driven experience, which was something I would have never expected from a God of War game. Health bars have now been added to enemies, meaning you no longer have to wait for a red halo to appear above their heads to know when they're close to death. It's a welcome change that allows for more strategic gameplay, as you can plan out when to use your special attacks and health pickups, which is particularly useful for some of the harder boss battles. Spartan Rage, a new feature in the game, allows Kratos to use devastating attacks with his fists. It grants him bonus damage and a speed boost. The combat is the deepest it's ever been in the series, and once you're used to it, it's the most enjoyable too. From a gameplay standpoint, the game takes a page out of the RPG handbook and introduces an inventory system to the franchise for the first time. Experience points are earned by finishing battles and completing quests. These can then be spent on learning new skills and abilities. As you journey through the realm, you'll collect resources that you can use to craft superior armor and upgrade the main weapon in your arsenal, the Leviathan Axe. Like Thor's hammer, the axe can be thrown at enemies, and by clicking triangle it will float back into Kratos' hands. I'm not the only one to say this, but it's strange how satisfying this little mechanic is. Kratos has 6 core statistics. Depending on the type of equipment you craft and how you spend your experience points, you can adjust the strength of each attribute to cater for your playstyle. In between the combat encounters are the puzzles you've come to expect from the series, and they're all surprisingly engaging. It's probably because every single one is propelled by the plot, as is all the fighting. The game does an excellent job of telling its tale while you're in control, and thanks to the seamless nature of its cutscenes, making you feel like you're in control even when you aren't. It's seriously amazing. There are also plenty of side missions to keep you busy, either during or after finishing the main storyline. Certain minor characters that you come across during your journey, such as the twin dwarven blacksmiths, will ask you to complete favours in exchange for rare resources and new weapon upgrades. The high level loot these quests reward you with make them worthwhile undertakings. With all this accompanying a sizable 20-hour or so story mode, the game's expansive scope means you can easily spend 40 plus hours completing everything it has to offer. It's really hard to fault the overall gameplay mechanics, but if I had to nitpick, it's with Kratos' inability to jump. Instead, you're expected to rely on a button prompt to move between 2 spots and a special marked ledge to climb up. It's a minor squabble given the story-driven nature of the game, but those who love the platforming aspects of the previous titles will likely be disappointed in the restrictiveness of Kratos' movement. The Northern Realms are forcefully presented with magnificent visuals and eye-popping vistas that all have a realistic gleam and are yet stylized enough to give credence to the fact that this is all based on Norse mythology. It's sweeping in scale yet intimate in scope. The HDR implementation is by far the best I've seen in a game. A sharp contrast and a diverse artistic palette makes every object, every vista look almost lifelike. The game has recently been updated for the PlayStation 5, where that extra horsepower pushes out a pristine 4K image alongside a flawless 60fps presentation. One of the biggest changes to the game visually is the over-the-shoulder camera angle that tracks Kratos in one continuous shot. From the opening frame to the very end, everything is done in one seamless shot. No breaks to cutscenes, no loading screens. It's ridiculously impressive considering the game was designed for the base PS4. The closer camera angle feels more intimate and provides greater detail to the action. It also helps to orientate the player, as even when there's too much going on screen, Kratos never gets lost amidst all the action like he did in the previous games. Sony Santa Monica should be commended for abandoning the idea of franchise reboots, something which has become increasingly popular in the last decade. Instead, God of War manages to find the right balance, paying homage to its old, deep-rooted and long-standing franchise history whilst perfectly infusing the new and the unexpected. If the franchise died under its own gaudiness years ago, let us rejoice this glorious rebirth. This is a new beginning for Kratos, not only by title, but God of War finds the heart behind Kratos' crusty exterior without sacrificing the franchise's penchant for brutal action and visceral violence. It's the emotional resonance of the father and son bond at the centre of the game's story that makes this game stand out for me. It's a relationship painted by tough love, a pragmatic stance in a cruel world as Kratos pushes Atreus to find his own path and his own answers. Simply put, God of War masterfully reimagines the franchise for a new generation. It takes the core experience, the brutal action, larger than life boss battles and stunning spectacle, but refreshes it with a semi-open world, RPG style gameplay and an unexpectedly emotional narrative. The story is absolutely riveting, the character work is second to none, the aesthetic is gorgeous and the gameplay is sublime. The result is a game unafraid to break convention and becoming all the better for it. In my opinion, God of War is an absolute must play, a game that should be experienced by all. It's the new gold standard and should be taken from now on as a reference to what the gaming industry is capable of and how it has already reached the heights of film depth and quality. And whilst a part of me feels conflicted saying this, I think God of War might just be the greatest game of all time. Welcome back Kratos, we missed you.